Chapter 4. Anselm Mayer von Rothschild. The Frankfurt firm, continued. What the considerations were which guided Mayer Amschel Rothschild when he turned his back upon Hanover to select Frankfurt as the place for starting in business on his own account, and for laying the foundations of a fortune which was to eventually attain such colossal proportions, are of course unknown to us, but we may reasonably suppose that his choice was influenced by early associations. Frankfurt was his birthplace, and it may be to this circumstance that it is indebted for the immense benefits it derived from the subsequent career of the great family within its walls. There can be no doubt that to the Rothschilds the city of Frankfurt owes not only its present importance, but much of its commercial prosperity. In settling in his native town and in starting business there, Mayer Amschel increased the chances in his favor, as he was intimately acquainted with the neighborhood and the opportunities of making money that were likely to present themselves. But whatever may have been his motives for returning to and settling in Frankfurt, we know that he did, in or about 1770, set up there in a humble way of business as a dealer in old coins, with a capital derived from his savings, and that his industry and honesty were such as to enable him to extend his sphere of action by dealing in works of art, old gold and silver, and, in course of time, to add to these pursuits bullion and bill broking. Gradually, as he strengthened his position, his business assumed more the nature of an ordinary banking business, which continued to raise the name and repute of the founder as a skillful and fair-dealing financier, in whom every confidence could be safely reposed. Little could Mayer Amschel have anticipated that the humble shop was destined to ultimately grow into one of the largest and most renowned banking firms of the world, and that his sons would in after years come to exercise such an unbounded sway that the peace of nations would depend upon their nod. That the powerful control they exercised on the European money markets would enable them to pose as the arbiters of peace and war, since they could at their pleasure withhold or furnish the pecuniary means required to carry on a campaign. But this, incredible as it may seem, was what their vast influence, combined with their enormous wealth and unlimited credit, enabled them to do, for no firms existed strong enough to oppose them for any length of time, or rash enough to take up a business which the Rothschilds had refused. To reach this exalted position, Mayer Amschel and his sons required the cooperation of the states, but when once he had jumped over their backs and reached the height of his ambition, he was independent of all aid and could act with the greatest freedom, whilst the states remained in a suppliant attitude at his feet. The House of Rothschild, when at the summit of its might, was the ruling power in Europe, for all the political powers were willing to acknowledge the sway of the great financial despot, and, like obedient vassals, to pay their tribute without a murmur. Frankfurt, the birthplace of this great firm, derives its name from a fort built by the Romans on the banks of the Main, to guard the frontiers and to resist the incursions of the Goths on the opposite bank, who, though daring enough in hand-to-hand contests, shrank from attacking an enemy hidden in a fort surrounded by high ramparts and deep ditches. By what Roman general Frankfurt was built is not, we believe, known, but during the reign of Charlemagne the place acquired additional importance from the palace constructed there by that great warrior, who brought quite a colony in his train. The Armeer, or Town Hall, is probably part of this palace, which was erected on the same plans as that at Aix-la-Chapelle. The natural advantages which Frankfurt possessed, from its favorable situation on the banks of the navigable Main, and the fruitfulness of the neighborhood, were all conducive from an early date to the growth of its trade. The whole of the commerce of Germany was at that time of the smallest, and Frankfurt was but a poor place, with an inconsiderable traffic, until the bright thought struck Charlemagne of uniting the Main with the Donau by a canal, thus enabling merchandise to be brought from Constantinople and the East directly into the heart of Germany. In order to attract thither people from other parts of Germany, and foreigners from other countries, he instituted yearly markets which afterwards gave rise to the famous fairs. In the midst of endless feuds between rapacious neighbors and raving knights, and in spite of the disturbed times, Frankfurt continued to grow in prosperity and importance, which were still further favored and fostered by several laws, passed with a view to providing escorts and protection to all visitors and traders, for the emperor saw and recognized of what vast moment trade was to the public welfare. Warehouses, granaries, and shops were built in large numbers, and Frederick E. showed how greatly he appreciated the advantages of trade by granting the city a charter for its autumn fair, a privilege still further extended by Ludovic E., who contributed largely to the prosperity and consequence of Frankfurt by the many diets he held there. There are numerous proofs existing to show that the power and influence of Frankfurt during the Middle Ages was considerable. Cologne and Strasbourg were its only business rivals. These three towns were by far the greatest centers of trade in that part of Germany. In wealth Frankfurt was inferior to few, whilst its dignity cannot have been small when it took precedence of stately Nuremberg at the coronation of Maximilian I. The golden bulls of the Pope declared that the Roman elections should always be held in Frankfurt, and this cannot have failed to favor the fortunes of the city, necessitating as it did splendid pageants and sumptuous banquets which made money flow freely into the pockets of the worthy citizens. In the course of time patents and privileges of all kinds tending to foster and encourage trade were conferred upon the city, and in 1510 the right of coining money was conceded to it by the emperor. The powerful Hanseatic League had broken down, and the fetters which it had kept on commercial activity in Germany were removed. Frankfurt was immediately sensible of the beneficial effects of the change, as Nuremberg began to send thither part of its manufactures, Augsburg its cloth and silk goods, and Ulm its linen and cotton goods. Even Aix-la-Chapelle and Dortmund entered into business relations with their young rival, who soon outstripped them in the race for first place, and continued to grow in consideration and wealth. The discovery of America was turned to profitable account, as the merchants and traders of Frankfurt were among the first who endeavored to extend their business relations to the New World. Trade in Frankfurt during the early part of the 17th century had been severely affected by the war, but towards the latter part it began to make rapid progress towards recovery, owing, no doubt, in a great measure to the famous fairs which attracted men of business from all parts of Europe. The rapid revival of its trade was still further promoted by the disappearance of the Hanseatic League, which had till then enjoyed a monopoly of the English cloth trade. This, however, now passed out of the hands of its traders, as a direct market was found for English goods in Frankfurt. The wine trade was equally flourishing, for Rhenish wines were highly esteemed in all parts of Europe. At this period a new branch of industry was started and rapidly extended by the enterprising traders, the trade in books. In a comparatively short time, owing to the extensive printing works which were erected, the book trade of Frankfurt assumed enormous proportions. The Great Autumn Fair soon came to be recognized as the largest book fair on the continent, for it was the rendezvous of booksellers and dealers from all parts of Europe. The concourse of persons attracted by the fair is said to have numbered as many as 400,000, so that the advantages derived from these monster gatherings must have been of the utmost value to the prosperity of the city. The rapid rise of Frankfurt had been watched with bitter jealousy by many of its older rivals, who tried to injure and destroy its trade by all means at their command. How intense was the animosity they cherished against their younger rival is seen from the fact that Nuremberg carried its hatred and envy so far as to forbid its citizens under pain of death from attending the Frankfurt fairs. Frankfurt, however, shrank from no sacrifice and spared no exertion to secure the safety of its trade. In all its leagues with its neighbors, the main condition of its cooperation was the support and protection to be given to the fairs. Everything was done to ensure the safety of visitors and their goods, escorts even being provided for that purpose. These famous fairs have evoked the wonder and surprise of many writers, who have borne testimony to their importance by the lavish praise they have bestowed upon them. The Frankfurt Fair, said one, is the chief of the yearly markets of the world, whilst another concisely described it as the world in a nutshell, or the magazine of the Germans. To the fairs Frankfurt is indebted for its first newspaper, the Messerlationen, which was in existence for some 200 years. The fairs likewise called into prominence a branch of business, namely, bills of exchange, which has tended greatly to facilitate and develop commercial transactions all over the world. Instead of the inconvenient and cumbrous method of settling every transaction by a money payment, recourse was had to the far more convenient and reasonable plan of paying by the medium of bills of exchange. If some such plan as this had not been adopted, the trade of Frankfurt could never have gone on increasing as it has done. When dealings had to be settled by a payment in money, they were necessarily on a very restricted scale owing to the immense weight of the coin, to say nothing of the risks that a person would run who was in the habit of carrying about with him large sums in cash. With bills of exchange the risk is greatly reduced, whilst the advantages they offer in transferability and portability are such as to need no demonstration. The fairs, as we have said, brought a vast business to Frankfurt, which was moreover a sort of halfway house for the rest of Germany, a large portion of the imports and exports passing through the hands of its merchants. Being then the center of trade, and doing an immense business in bills of exchange, the Frankfurt prices came to be watched and studied with as much care as those of other great commercial centers such as Rotterdam or Antwerp. The importance of the Frankfurt Exchange after the Rothschilds had founded their extensive business was vastly increased owing to the intimate connections and vast influence possessed by the firm in the other large cities of Europe. In every large town they have either branches of their own or active agents who are ever seeking to promote their interests and ever faithfully reporting to them all that occurs in financial or commercial circles. This goes far to explain the problem how they have been able to amass their immense fortune so rapidly, for it must not be forgotten that the members of the family, while carrying on their respective businesses independently of each other, on all momentous occasions unite their forces for the common benefit, and temporarily concentrate all their thoughts and energies on achieving the success of the operations in hand. It is hardly strange, therefore, to find that the wheel of fortune, when the family bring their collective wealth and influence to bear in this fashion upon it, should yield to their persuasive efforts and take the direction they desire. On the death of Mayer Amschel, the founder of the firm, the management of the affairs of the Frankfurt house naturally passed into the hands of his eldest son, Anselm Mayer, who retained it until his death, which took place on the 6th December, 1855. Anselm Mayer was above all things a man of business, in which his inmost soul seemed concentrated. These words sum up his whole character. But, able and clever as he was, the individuality of his third brother Nathan, the head of the London house, was even more striking in regard to business matters, for he distinguished himself from his elder brother by his unrivaled financial skill and daring, by his greater shrewdness, and by his intuitive power of forecasting the course of either the money market or of politics, all of which gifts he turned to the utmost profit. In a word, Nathan Mayer was a greater financier, a greater speculator and manipulator, and, although self-taught, of more solid and useful acquirements. To the house this was, however, of secondary importance, seeing that the more weighty operations were planned and carried out by all the brothers in concert, whilst the times in which they lived were so eminently favourable to the success of their enterprises that to them they are as much indebted for the sudden growth of their immense wealth and power as to their own abilities and energies. It is here, indeed, that we must seek the explanation of the problem how they have been able in so short a time to extend and develop their business so amazingly. Circumstances, or, in other words, luck was on their side. Not that they trusted blindly to their luck, for they contributed in no small measure to their success by the prudent caution which marked all their dealings, and by the observance of maxims which had been carefully learnt and as carefully practiced by all members of the family, and of these maxims the most important was to seize upon the right moment in all political or commercial crises and turn it to profitable account. We cannot pretend at this distance of time to be capable of giving a faithful and lifelike description of Anselm Mayer von Rothschild, the head of the Frankfurt FRM. We prefer, therefore, to reproduce the words of a writer who was for many years on the most intimate terms with him, and whose account may consequently be regarded as privileged and deserving credit. Anselm Mayer is the oldest of the European nabobs, with thoroughly Eastern features and all the old Jewish customs and practices. He wears his hat down on the back of his head, which is covered with snow-white hair, and his coat, usually unbuttoned, hangs negligently down from his shoulders. He has an open and frank countenance, on which rests an air of assumed vivacity, whenever he thinks he is observed. His hands are usually in his trouser pockets playing with money. He invariably goes on foot, and to every beggar who accosts him he gives a coin of more or less value. His beneficence is very great indeed. The poor Jewish families in Frankfurt are mostly dependent on his bounty. It was he who contributed the greater part of the funds for the erection of the new Jewish hospital. When the weather is unusually severe, or when, for instance, a poor family is burnt out, he is particularly liberal in his charity. Should a hard frost or a prolonged drought set in, a large crowd is sure to be seen collected before the doors of his town residence in the Fargas. His house in the above-named street is an ill-looking building from the outside, and no stranger, as he passed, would guess that it was the abode of one of the richest merchants in the world. Anselm Mayer sits in his office in the midst of his clerks like a padishah. Below him are his secretaries, and around him may be seen a crowd of brokers, forever coming and going. With a few words he dismisses each, for like a true business genius he knows at once what answer to give to every question, and what decision to arrive at on any business that may be laid before him for consideration. No one in the universe, when Anselm Mayer's yes or no has once been pronounced, would venture to renew the discussion. To speak to him privately on a matter of business is well nigh impossible. Everything in his office is done openly as in a law court. He observes and keeps the officers as scrupulously as any of his clerks, and has indeed less opportunities for recreation than they have, seeing that even in the theatre he is likely to be disturbed and called away by the arrival of one of his couriers. For the same reason he is often forced to rise from bed in the night, to peruse the news and dispatches just brought by an express, so that he can, in case of need, forward them on without delay to his brothers in Paris, Vienna, or London. To facilitate this business he has had an office erected adjoining his bedroom. He has many orders and titles, but usually he wears only the Hessian ribbon. The diplomatists resident in Frankfurt, and those who may make a transitory visit there, vie in doing the great financier honor, and the most splendid banquets are given on each side. At these entertainments Anselm Mayer sits in true penance, as he never touches any viands or dishes that have not been cleansed or prepared in the Jewish fashion. This strict and unaffected observance of the religious injunctions of his faith is greatly to his honor. He is indeed regarded as the most religious Jew in Frankfurt. All writers agree in describing Anselm Mayer as a man of great shrewdness of judgment, with a thorough knowledge of mankind. By a sort of intuition he was able to form a pretty correct opinion of the character and motives of the men with whom he came in contact. No matter what cloak they might use to conceal their real object, he saw through their hypocrisy almost before they had said a word. He seldom erred in his judgment, and was remarkably quick in detecting the vanity or self-conceit of those who addressed him. True and able men were always appreciated by him at their just value. He would always deal with them at par. A man who showed himself quiet but efficient in the discharge of his duties was sure to be noticed and favored. In his conversation Anselm Mayer was somewhat confidential, though he always allowed a certain reserve to be visible which effectually prevented the display of any want of respect towards himself. He was a man of some humour, and is remembered for the many sly and witty sayings which figured in his conversation, and with which he was in the habit of administering keen rebukes, or speaking unpalatable truths, calculated, if uttered in a stronger and plainer form, to have given offence. The many anecdotes related of him all display more or less the humour and shrewdness for which he was remarkable, and are often conspicuous for their brevity. He knew also how to clothe his sallies in befitting language. When Thorwaldsen passed through Germany he was received with enthusiastic welcomes everywhere, and innumerable banquets were given in his honor. At one of these gatherings Rothschild was introduced to the sculptor, and made the neat remark, "You look so handsome, Chevalier, that one is forced to believe you created yourself." Thorwaldsen afterwards acknowledged that he had never been paid a more novel or more flattering compliment. Fond of wit and humour as he was, Anselm Mayer could recognize and reward wit in others, even if the sally was directed against himself. On one occasion a man wrote to him, simply saying, "Herr Baron, send me 1,000 guldens and forget me." The brevity and essentially witty character of the demand at once struck Anselm Mayer, who, in forwarding the sum demanded, replied, "I send you 1,000 guldens and have forgotten you." When Baron Anselm Mayer went in 1832 to spend a few months of the summer at Ems, he took up his quarters in a private house on the Romerberg. At the same house there was also staying Baron von E., a dashing Prussian Uhlan officer, with whom Baron Anselm soon became exceedingly friendly. One evening they went for a stroll in the direction of the Four Towers, and in the midst of a spirited conversation Rothschild came to a sudden halt. Taking advantage of this, an ill-clad man stole noiselessly up behind the famous banker and cleverly opened his pocket. Baron von E., who had noticed the suspicious movement, naturally concluded that theft was the man's object. But to his surprise he noticed that the man quietly slipped a letter into the pocket and disappeared. Scarcely had Baron Rothschild resumed his walk ere the inconvenience arising from the recent contribution made itself felt. He put his hand into his pocket to discover the reason, and at once exclaimed, "Oh, I know now." It was evident that the mere touch had explained the mystery. The walk was continued along the road to Koblenz, and when they at last turned to retrace their steps dusk was already setting in. Suddenly from behind a tree a ragged fellow sprang forward and placed himself directly in Baron Anselm's path. The Baron's companion was about to strike the fellow, when he noticed the latter had neither pistol nor stiletto in his hand, but simply a begging letter, which he sought in this violent fashion to force on Anselm Mayer. The latter betrayed not the slightest surprise or alarm, and it was evident he was by no means unaccustomed to this novel way of delivering begging letters. One very warm summer's day, when Baron Anselm was entertaining some friends at dinner, a window directly opposite his seat happened to be unclosed. Through the aperture thus left there presently came flying, during the dessert, a packet, so well aimed that it fell right upon the Baron's plate. The guests were not unnaturally astonished, but Anselm Mayer quietly felt in his pocket, took out a gold piece and put it in the cover of the still unopened letter, which he returned with the same celerity and by the same way it had come. This novel and unique mode of bestowing charity was highly appreciated by his guests. Rothschild, however, was not satisfied. He could not feel easy until he knew what had become of the letter and its contents. Apologizing, therefore, to the company, he asked permission to rise a moment. He then advanced to the open window, leaned out and returned, evidently satisfied and happy, saying, half audibly, "Platchert." It is interesting to notice how solicitous the wealthy financier was, from force of habit, to know whether even such a trifle as that which he had just given away, had been well bestowed. Baron Anselm Mayer was proud and aristocratic in his manners only to the extent that the consciousness of his personal importance and influence was allowed to be visible, but still without any arrogance. He related, not unwillingly, the small beginnings and struggles of his firm, his walks to the office, the Friday evenings spent in the old house in the Judengasse, where white bread and roasted nuts were his fare. He referred with sovereign contempt to the conceit and arrogance of certain upstarts. He did not mix himself up with politics, and invariably spoke with considerate forbearance of the different governments, though his partiality for Austria was always unmistakably manifest. He bestowed enormous sums in almsgiving, and, when they remembered the many calls upon his purse, and the immense amount actually distributed by him every year among the poor and the suffering, many persons, whose petitions soliciting aid for themselves or for others failed to meet with the response anticipated, have come to think more favorably of the seeming coldness they had experienced. It is impossible to estimate or describe the wonderful good effected by means of Baron Anselm's beneficence. But how great it was and how profoundly appreciated, is evidenced by the thousands of applications for relief which were annually submitted to his consideration. When he died the poor lost one of their most liberal, and at the same time most unostentatious benefactors. He had been brought up in the midst of a family struggling hard to earn a living. His youth was passed in continued and incessant toil, so it is but natural that he was not able to boast of a very high or classical education. In later years he tried, not without success, to improve his knowledge of languages and history, and to strengthen his bodily powers, but, ever conscious of his shortcomings, he would turn away offended if any sycophant flattered him on his horsemanship or any other accomplishment. French and English he spoke very indifferently. Indeed, it was only the interests of his business and perhaps a little vanity that led him ever to converse in these languages, which he spoke even worse than he did his native German. Towards ladies he always displayed a very engaging address, a lively gallantry, which he retained to the last. His love of art showed itself most strongly in his taste for combs and old metal work. But still on paintings he was often heard to say a shrewd word of criticism. Above all things, however, he loved his garden. It was his delight to revel among his beautiful flowers, of which he never grew weary. His position as a resident in Frankfurt differed in no way from that of any other member of the Jewish community. Great as were his wealth and influence, they did not enable him to share the civil and political rights enjoyed by every Christian living in the city. For a brief period the Jews were permitted by the Prince Primate in 1812 to rank on an equal footing with their Christian neighbors, but in 1815 they were deprived of these privileges, which were not restored to them till 1853 and 1864. Whilst at one time the founder of the House of Rothschild was a member of the elective assembly, his son, equally with the poorest Jew in Frankfurt, was debarred from taking any active part in the management of civic affairs, for he lacked the first qualification, the freedom of the city, without which none could hold office. Although siding with the strictly orthodox party of the Talmudic Judaism, Anselm Mayer did not allow any difference of opinion to disturb his sympathies with his co-religionists, and he is known to have frequently contributed largely to the erection of synagogues where the teaching would be wholly opposed to that which he favored. At his death he left a fortune estimated as amounting to from 50 to 60 million gulden, which he willed to one of his nephews. To the Jewish community he bequeathed a handsome legacy of 1,200,000 guldens, and several others proportionately large for the benefit of the poor, who, he was fond of saying as he walked through the streets, were his courtiers. He also left strict orders in his will for the maintenance and preservation of the old house in the Judengasse. Strict Jew as was the head of the Frankfurt House, opposed as he was to every innovation in the doctrine and ritual of the synagogues, and exact as he was in his observance of the Sabbath, he nevertheless did not hesitate to trade and make money on feast days. Thus, on one occasion when he was in Aix-la-Chapelle taking part in the Congress there, a sum of money amounting to 160,000 thalers fell due to him on a Saturday. At the proper hour he presented himself at the office and demanded his money. On his attention being called to the day, he pointedly answered, "It is not every day one has to receive 160,000 thalers." He then carefully counted and pocketed the money. The extent of the business transacted by the parent firm in Frankfurt was something immense. It not only embraced the majority of the German states and principalities, but included in its clientele a large proportion of the nobility and aristocracy, especially those of South Germany, whose pecuniary resources were so embarrassed as to render the assistance of a financial house necessary and unavoidable. The number of accounts of the Frankfurt House probably far exceeded that of any one of the other houses in London, Paris, or Vienna. To prove how liberal the Rothschilds were to the German princes, and to show what profitable customers the latter must have been, we give a list of those who were forced to apply to the firm for aid. Against the name of each we place the total amount of the loans, as far as can be ascertained, which he obtained. Guddens, Eisenberg Burstein, 41,100,000 Elwenstein Wertheim, 1,250,000 Sen Wittgenstein Berlberg, 300,000 Waldberg Zeil, 2. 1. WW. 172,000 Graf Sander v. Schlawnitsche. 670,000 Ritter von Ries. 250,000. Eisenberg Victor Spock. 294,000. Guddens. Solmslich. 300,000 Lowenstein Rosenberg. 300,000 Prince Victor zu Eisenberg. 140,000 Count Victor. 700,000 Chapri. 300,000 Leinen Westerberg. 80,000. Jon Miki. 340,000 von HN80. 500,000 von Scheckenje. 1,800,000 Henkel v. Donnersmarck. 1,125,000 von Froberg. 100,000 Prince von Galanthe Esterhazy. 6,400,000 Freiherr von Greifenklau. 180,000 Prince Schwarzenberg. 95 million Waldberg Wulfeg. 800,000 Waldsee. 350,000. Count K. von Wartenberg. 2,070,000 total. Guddens 16,021,000. This list is far from complete. Still, even as it is, it gives some idea of the large business done by the firm with its private clients. In conclusion, we may say a few words respecting the sovereignty of Baron Anselm Mayer over the Frankfurt Bourse, and of the complete subordination of that institution to his will. Before the advent of the Rothschilds, Frankfurt could claim no precedence over the other great trading cities of Germany. It had a large commerce, and large operations were carried on in foreign bills, but still its quotations were not so important or so influential as to cause them to be closely watched and studied. All this, however, is now altered. The movements of the Frankfurt Exchange have, through the magnitude of the transactions carried out by the House of Rothschild, acquired an importance which makes itself felt on the markets of other leading financial centers. Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and London are in such close communication and connection through the houses established there by the Rothschilds, that no great movement can take place in one of them without creating a marked impression in the rest. In Frankfurt the control and sway possessed by the parent house were more marked and manifest, perhaps, than was the case with its branches elsewhere. Loud and frequent complaints were made by other banking and financial firms of the prejudicial effects on business caused by the entire dependence of the Frankfurt Bourse on the will of Anselm Mayer, who could at his pleasure raise or depress prices to the discomfiture of all who might happen to oppose him. The public prints were forever complaining of and animadverting upon the pressure of the great firm on the energies and spirits of the Bourse. Their complaints were always worded in the same unvaried strain, so that they became quite monotonous in their repetition. For instance, the remark that money was more abundant, and might become still more so, were it not for the knowledge that the Rothschilds are so completely masters of the situation, and have the market under complete control, was a stock expression with the Frankfurt editors. This pressure could not fail to prove injurious to many smaller houses, but complaints availed not. Business was free to all, and speculation unhindered. The Rothschilds were at liberty to conduct their operations on whatever lines they pleased, without asking permission of any. The same freedom of action belonged to all, whether great or small. Might on the stock exchange means right, and if weaker speculators were made to pay heavily for the opposition, however slight, they offered to the rule of the colossal firm, they had but themselves to blame for their folly and loss. Foreign loans became the perquisites, if we may so call them, of the Rothschilds, who were ever on the alert to secure them before a rival had any chance to step in. On one occasion another firm was bold enough to undertake a Belgian loan, on its own sole responsibility behind Rothschild's back, but was quickly made to repent of its temerity, as Rothschild put his forces in motion and bore down upon it with such resistless force that the rival house was soon glad to give in its submission and tender an apology for its presumption. But, on the other hand, it is totally undeniable that, at different times, in circumstances of great financial pressure and during commercial crises, Rothschild rendered immense services by means of his unbounded wealth and credit to many houses, who, but for the support thus liberally provided, would have been forced to suspend payment. Not that we wish it to be supposed that Rothschild made such sacrifices from purely unselfish motives, for, however unfavorable they might appear, he usually managed to turn the circumstances of the case to profitable account. For instance, in 1832, a well-known banking establishment in Paris had accepted without adequate security a large number of bills drawn by a bank in North America, whose credit at that time was decidedly low. The suspension at an early date of the bank in Paris was discussed and anticipated. Rothschild himself had a great many of these doubtful acceptances in his portfolio. What did he do? He voluntarily placed the sum of 40 million thalers at the disposal of the bank, whose failure was averted, if only for a moment, as the public, seeing the apparent confidence of Baron Anselm in its solvability, not unnaturally concluded he had good reasons for his liberality and that the rumors to the contrary were ill-founded. The Paris house was saved, whilst the transaction proved very remunerative to Rothschild himself, as he had remitted this sum not in specie or bills on other firms, but in bills, which he had bought dirt cheap, upon the bank itself. In this way, wrote a German journalist of Baron Anselm Mayer, he has made himself king of finance, and his kingdom is no poetical creation but a reality. His vassals are the other banking firms and financial institutions, whom he can destroy, if he so pleases, when he no longer needs them, or support and strengthen as long as they are useful and necessary for his purposes. Since the death of Anselm Mayer, the business of the Frankfurt firm has been managed by his nephews, Baron William and Baron C. von Rothschild, who have faithfully observed the traditional policy of the family in all their financial operations. The wealth of the two brothers continues steadily to augment, thanks to the prudence and caution which mark all their undertakings. Baron Karl is a great patron of the arts, and has a collection of pictures and sculptures such as is possessed by only very few. Baron William is a most strict Jew, and rigidly observes the fasts and feasts of the Jewish calendar. The death of Baron Karl, which took place quite recently, leaves his brother the sole head of the Frankfurt house. Baron Karl's magnificent collection of art treasures will become the property of Lord Rothschild.